Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Patch 3.27.0c is not here yet, but Grinding Gear Games did put out a little bit of a teaser. 7 of the Foulborn uniques that are coming in this patch. These vary from the obviously powerful Foulborn Headhunter, which is just a headhunter with slightly different stats on it, through to a couple of things that are more build around, and a couple of things that are of questionable utility. Although it is worth saying that Foulborn Utula's Hunger, whilst I don't think I'm going to use it personally, it's not quite as bad as people are giving it credit for. We'll come back to that one in a sec. Let's go left to right through what we've got here though, and discuss where they might be used, and also whether they're likely to be particularly popular or not. So Cybil's Paw is a claw that pretty much no one tends to use. It provides caster stats on a claw, which is an odd mix, and it does so in a way that's kind of been power crept out of existence. However, this new version has a pretty explosive modifier on it. Recover energy shield equal to 1% of evasion rating when you block. Now the obvious comparison is to a superior caster offhand by the name of Aegis Aurora. Now I'm saying caster offhand, obviously it can be played on builds that aren't casters, but Aegis Aurora is something you can use if you want an all defensive setup on a character. Cybil's Paw's Foulborn version does some of this, but it only goes halfway. So recover energy shield equal to 1% of evasion rating when you block, as opposed to Aegis Aurora being 2% of armor. It is actually possible to get a lot more armor than it is to get evasion rating, so keep that in mind as well, although doing so does require that you take iron reflexes on the tree. So you're not going to be seeing builds that get 500,000 evasion rating the way that you can get 500,000 or even 1,000,000 or more armor. However, all you need for this to be explosive is 100,000. At that point, every time you block, you're recovering 1,000 energy shield immediately, and that is going to be off the charts compared to alternatives like the Foulborn version of the Surrender. Also on top of this, if you've got 75% attack block on your character, this item is going to be giving you a 120% increased spell damage. This is not a full caster weapon, but it is something that feels like it's a part of the way to what a caster weapon would provide. And that's important because ultimately you're not getting Aegis Aurora here, you're not getting a caster weapon here, you're getting half of each. Is that something you want? Well, if you can solve the problems to make this work, then there are definitely payoffs there. I think that this is only really going to feel good in conjunction with Mageblood, because the amount of evasion rating you're going to need for this to actually be a strong defensive layer is going to be reasonably hard to get, and you're also going to need to balance that against needing to invest into block on the passive tree. I don't expect to see a lot of people using this, but I do think some people will find a good use for it. So next we have Utula's Hunger. Now, I was thinking, what is the possible use case for this item? Firstly, let's just start with what this is not. This is not a defensive item. People can look at this and say 1,167 energy shield, that is going to be something that competes with another 1,167 ES chest piece, such as a Twilight Regalia. I think the answer is no, that is not the way that this is going to be used. This is to be used in conjunction with Eldritch Battery, and it's to be used in conjunction with Eldritch Battery on builds that cannot equip that 1,167 ES Twilight Regalia, because they're not invested heavily into the top end of the tree, and they don't have anything like the requisite 293 intelligence to equip a Twilight Regalia. That fundamentally is where I would use this item if I was forced to use this item. But it's worth noting that the conditions on this are severe if there are no defense modifiers on other equipped items. I want to show you a unique item that no one thinks of as a defense modifier item. Everyone thinks of it as an attribute item. And this is Shaper's Touch. You're probably familiar with this if you've played a lot at endgame. And guess what? It has a defense tag mod. All the reasons you would equip this are the things it does to your attributes. However, 80 to 120% increased armor and energy shield. Just this modifier alone ends up meaning that you can't use it in conjunction with Foulborn Utula's Hunger. This is the real problem here. What alternatives would I recommend if you want the effect of Eldritch Battery and enough energy shield to seriously use it, but you don't want to go through all the hoops of making sure that every single item on your character does not have a defense tag mod? Devouring Diadem is choice number one. This is going to take up your helmet slot, so it's not an option for everyone, but it is pretty good. It does have an intelligence requirement. That intelligence requirement is only 112. And the second choice is a Battery Staff. This has a 117 intelligence requirement. Again, much more manageable than 293 on a Twilight Regalia. And again, it's going to provide you with much of the same effect, although it's worth noting that this is only for the gems that are socketed inside the Battery Staff. So you do have other options here, but maybe you're determined to tattoo over every single intelligence passive on your tree. Well, in that case, that's maybe not the smartest choice, but Foulborn Utula's Hunger is there to bail you out from the consequences of the decisions you've made. After this, we have the Foulborn version of Doon Cuebiyari. This is an interesting item. This is an item where the base version has really fallen off in popularity over the years. Now, the mod that's changed is 1% increased damage per 8 strength when it's in your main hand. And it's worth noting that a very, very fortunate Tempering Orb, which gives you 25% reduced effect of attribute modifiers as a drawback, can actually improve that to 6, or can improve this one from per 12 strength to per 9 strength. So it is something that can be improved slightly through the use of that obscure mechanic. Foulborn Doon Cuebiyari is sacrificing some of that damage in order to get a lot of mana. You can get some of this back if you were to use Crown of the Inward Eye and then take advantage of Transfiguration of Mind, but you are still going to come out behind on pure damage. The only reason to use this item is if you have a lot of flat mana on your build. However, there are a number of builds at the moment that scale a lot of flat mana, and whilst Kinetic Blast of Clustering players cannot use this item, that is not the case when it comes to Archmage players. This ultimately is an Archmage item, and it's something that I think it's worth just experimenting with whether you can make it fit into your Archmage build. The key difficulty you're going to face though is that it is pushing you down a strength stacking direction, and you've got to decide whether strength stacking is something that is appropriate for the way that you've got your Archmage set up or not. After this, we have Foulborn The Searing Touch. Now, I have played Searing Bond back in patch 3.22. This is not going to make Searing Bond good. It's not that Searing Bond gets anything from the stat that's removed. You're losing 10% cast speed. You don't care about 10% cast speed. It's at +3 to the maximum number of summoned Searing Bond totems. Sounds like it's a fantastic modifier for Searing Bond. In practice, it kind of isn't. And that's because what Searing Bond does these days, it has a quality bonus. And back when I played it in 3.22, this was actually an alternate quality. And this is 0.1 per quality to the maximum number of summoned totems. Now, you do definitely want 20 quality for the number of totems that you've got from Searing Bond to feel good. But ultimately, the problem that you're going to have is that placing the totems takes too long. This item would be better if it had totem placement speed. This item would be better if it had increased maximum distance to place a totem on it in place of that mod. Where is this useful? This item ultimately is only of use if you are looking for something just to get started on a character. If you happen to have this really early in progression, before you can afford a 20 quality version of the Searing Bond gem, at that point this is going to feel pretty solid. This is definitely going to be something that will help make the playstyle smoother, but you're no longer going to want it once you get your 20 quality version of Searing Bond and level that up a little bit. At that point, you're just going to want traditional caster weapons instead. And all of this is based upon the decision that you've made to play Searing Bond totems, which is just basically Fire Trap, but a little bit worse. It's not as much worse as a lot of people think, but it is definitely not quite as good as Fire Trap, and ultimately, there's a reason that people have consolidated as hard as they have on Righteous Fire being one skill, and Fire Trap being the other. It's that Searing Bond, whilst it's good enough to get the job done, Fire Trap is just better, and Foulborn The Searing Touch does not provide the stats that would turn that around. This is, however, something you might use at certain points in progression if you just happen to come across it. And next we have Foulborn Rigwald's Quills. Rigwald's Quills base item is something that was, for a period, extremely, extremely popular. That was because there was a bug with arrows forking. At that point, they could multi-hit after forking, and this resulted in it doing absolutely crazy amounts of damage. That's been patched, and Rigwald's Quills now provides damage projection in exchange for not getting much else out of your quiver slot. You get lightning resistance, negative fire resistance, negative projectile speed. I would say that those mods together are pretty much nothing. 7 life per enemy hit with attacks is small enough to be almost nothing, and 23% increased global accuracy rating isn't a lot. And so if you're using this, it is entirely because of the fork, and in the case of the Foulborn version, the 39% chance to aggravate bleeding on targets you hit with attacks. That said, this is very much a build liberating item. What I mean by a build liberating item, at the moment, if you want to play Bleed Bow, you're kind of forced to be Gladiator, and Gladiator doesn't have enough other support for the Bleed Bow archetype. As a result, Bleed Bow is pretty much unplayed. Well, with Foulborn Rigwald's Quills, you can get the aggravation of bleed, and you can do so on ascendancies that are not Gladiator, and you can do so without Forbidden Jewels from the Gladiator ascendancy either. This is something, though, that is going to take a tricky playstyle. You're going to want to have one skill that hits really hard, and one skill that hits really fast, and you're going to want to alternate between the two of them. The difficult part here, I think, is that because it's RNG to aggravate the bleeding, you're sometimes going to get unlucky streaks. you're going to hit a massive, massive bleed on some boss that you're fighting. Let's say it's the Uber Shaper. You'll be watching his health trickle down, and then you're going to hit him 7 times in a row with other lighter projectile skills, and each one of them is going to fail to win that roll to aggravate the bleeding. And as a result, you're going to end up getting pretty derisory results from that initial bleed. That's going to feel really bad when it happens, because this is going to be one of those very, very RNG heavy items. This is going to take a lot of playing around with to make it work, but I do think there is the potential for a build there, and it's going to be a build that didn't exist prior to this item coming out. Ultimately, that's one of the best things you can ask for when it comes to a new unique, and it'll be interesting to see if this ends up being sought after or not. Side note, the mod that you're losing here is actually a pretty decent mod on base Rigwald's Quills, but it's one that doesn't really help a bleed build very much. After this, we have Foulborn Vaal Caress. Foulborn Vaal Caress is less reliable and more explosive than the base version. The problem with Vaal Caress is not that the item isn't good, it's that rare items in the same slot are just so explosively good. On certain builds, this is one of the best things you can find while you're leveling. +5 to the level of Vaal skills is utterly crazy when it comes to skills like Vaal Reap. And it's important to note that if you do socket Vaal Reap into a Vaal Caress or a Foulborn Vaal Caress, they both have the same mod here, then both the Vaal version of that Reap gem, but also the base version of that Reap gem, will get the +5 to gem levels. That's why it's so good while you're leveling. However, the problem that you hit is that at some point you want to switch over to having a 6-link, because a 6-link tends to be slightly better damage than a 4-link with +5 gem levels, and on top of that, your 6-link will then free up the ability to use Eldritch mods on your gloves, and potentially Eldritch mods on your chest as well. So once you get to that point, Foulborn Vaal Caress as well as the original Vaal Caress tend to fall off a little bit. It's not the item is bad, it's that it tends to get outscaled by rares. The other mods on this, though, are actually reasonably good, obviously with the exception of the -5 to the level of socketed non-Vaal gems, which does prevent you from using things like Empower with it. But you've got some life, you've got some cold resistance, you've got some base defenses, not a lot, but something. But then you have the thing that varies between this and the OG. The OG grants you Onslaught for 20 seconds. Often this means you've got Onslaught almost all the time, on the sort of builds that make extensive use of Vaal skills. Foulborn version, you gain Adrenaline, much more powerful buff, but you have 85% less uptime on it. You only get 3 seconds of Adrenaline. This is something that I think most builds are going to prefer the OG on, but there will definitely be exceptions, and this is definitely an item that some people will end up continuing to use. After that, we just have pure power. Foulborn Headhunter loses the strength, which does actually hurt, because strength on Headhunter is something that just solves problems, but in exchange for that, rare and unique enemies within 120 meters stand out to you on the minimap. This is better than it sounds. This is something we had access to in Affliction League. It doesn't sound like it does very much, but it will definitely save you a lot of time when it comes to completing certain maps. And ultimately, time saved is a loot acquisition multiplier. That is the reason that Foulborn Headhunter is as good as it is. A lot of the time you'll spend 10 seconds looking for the last monster that is tied to a particular league mechanic. With Foulborn Headhunter, you'll never have to do that. Now this one's interesting in that it is going to dilute the pool of other Headhunter mods that exist. However, it's not necessarily going to do this in a bad way, because of the existing Foulborn Headhunter mods that exist, one of them is worse than the baseline item, and by quite a lot. And the other one is slightly better. I think adding this one in, which is mostly neutral or maybe slightly worse, is going to make it so that Headhunters on average are slightly better overall when they come from the Foulborn system. However, we don't know the way that these are generated. We don't ultimately know whether the chance of getting this new version of Foulborn Headhunter is coming solely at the expense of other Foulborn Headhunter combinations that could have come up, or whether it's coming at the expense of just any random unique item that you could have got instead. We don't know the way they're generated, and that puts limits on exactly what we can do when it comes to optimization. Anyway, that's the 7 new uniques that are coming. 1 very obviously powerful item, 1 powerful build enabling item, 3 niche roleplayer items, and then finally 2 items that are weaker than the rest, but that do have at least a tiny narrow niche where they're okay. And that's almost the end of the video, except for one little thing I'll mention, and that is that in case you missed it, yesterday I did my meta roundup, 11 days into the Keepers League, what builds are doing well, what builds are doing poorly. There's a link to that up on the screen at the moment. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.